In this segment, we're going to take a look at our good friend Johnny Marshall from Virginia and his efforts to make the judicial branch an equal branch of the government. His important legal precedents established by the John Marshall Court strengthened the role of the U.S. Supreme Court as an equal branch of the national government. We're going to take a look at three of his significant court cases. The first one, Marbury versus Madison. This was 1803. Thomas Jefferson was president, but the case dates back to that period of time between John Adams' presidency and Thomas Jefferson's presidency. It seems that Mr. Marbury was given a seat on the judicial bench by John Adams as he was leaving office. When Thomas Jefferson arrived, the letter announcing that Marbury would have that job was still sitting on the bench. When James Madison asked Thomas Jefferson, "What are we going to do about this?" Jefferson replied, "Don't deliver it." Well, Mr. Marbury wanted his job, so he sued. The court case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court as Marbury challenged Madison for his job on the bench in the courts. As it turns out, the John Marshall Court decided that the judicial act that gave John Adams the power to give Marbury that job was invalid or unconstitutional. This was the first time that the Supreme Court had declared a law or an action of government unconstitutional. That's what judicial review means. This allows the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal courts to take a look at laws and actions of the executive branch to decide if they meet constitutional standards. And if they don't, according to judicial review, they are thrown out as they are declared unconstitutional. This is perhaps the most important Supreme Court case from John Marshall, as it establishes that power of the courts over the other two branches of government as part of checks and balances. Another important court case under the John Marshall Court was McCulloch versus Maryland. This happened in 1819, and as you can see from the graphic, it had to do with the bank. Well, the U.S. National Bank was created even though the power to create it did not exist in the Constitution. That's what we call the implied powers. When the U.S. government created the National Bank, it took the ideas from the delegated powers in the Constitution, and they decided that it would be necessary and proper to create a U.S. national bank. Well, this was a huge debate, and we'll learn more about this in some of the upcoming segments, and the state of Maryland was very, very upset. Well, in 1819, a court case sprang up because the state of Maryland decided they would lay heavy taxes on a branch of the U.S. National Bank in Maryland. The National Bank did not feel that it owed any taxes to Maryland, and so it went ultimately to court. John Marshall ruled that the states do not have the power to levy taxes against the national government. And at the same time, the national government doesn't have the power to levy taxes against state governments either. The power to tax, said John Marshall, is the power to destroy. And so by stepping in right here, John Marshall shows that the national government cannot be held victim to what the whims of any single state are. The last case we want to look at is Gibbons versus Ogden. This had to do with interstate commerce. It seems that Mr. Ogden was given a monopoly to run steamboat lines in New York. Well, Mr. Gibbons felt that he wanted to run a steamboat line between New York and New Jersey. While not going entirely inside New York, Mr. Ogden said, "Hey, that's mine." Gibbons said, "No, I'm allowed." The result was a lawsuit. And in this lawsuit that went ultimately to the Supreme Court, John Marshall ruled that there could not be a monopoly between states. Therefore, Mr. Gibbons should have the right to run a ferry between New York and New Jersey. This was the first time that the Supreme Court decided an issue between states, but it also sets the precedent or tradition that the Supreme Court can decide issues not just between commerce, but also between states and even between the branches of government. The decisions of the John Marshall Court helped strengthen the power of the national government. It defined the judiciary branch as an equal branch of government and solidified the true power and the strength of the U.S. national government.